Is it, in fact, a good day for democracy in the US? What is the price that the government of the United Kingdom has put on the lives of Afghan children killed by its military? Who is behind the latest airstrikes on the Iraq-Syria border? Salams, you're watching Daily Debrief coming to you from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani, and these are some of the questions we'll be asking our guests and reporters on the show today. First up, a good day for democracy is what Joe Biden thinks it is, as his Democratic Party performed better than many pundits predicted in the US midterm elections. Donald Trump, the leading figure on the side of the grand old party, cut a slightly more disappointed figure, toning back a little on the early rhetoric of a red, that's the color of course identified with the Republican Party, wave across the country. Natalia Marquez is in New York City and is following, of course, results and reactions, and joins us now over video conference. Natalia, good to have you back on the show. Joe Biden saying a good day, he thinks, for democracy. How are you seeing it? What is your analysis from what we know so far?
Yeah, so various pundits were predicting a massive red wave, or Republicans winning, sweeping victories throughout the House and the Senate. A lot of this was because of the low approval rating of Joe Biden, whose his approval rating is around 37%, I believe, which is the same as Trump's approval rating was at this point in his presidency. But this didn't really happen, right? So you see that the Senate is actually a toss-up. So one seat flipped in Pennsylvania. John Fetterman won. It flipped from Republican to Democrat. And the House, although the majority of seats seem to be going to the Republicans, the House is not, it's not a sweeping victory for Republicans either. So it's not a red wave. The Democratic Party did do better than predicted.
Right.
And, there are various, predictions as, hypotheses as to why the right-wing program was not very popular, things like abortion rights, issues of democratic voting rights. These were not, the Republican program for these issues was not very popular. But also, I think that this says more about how unpopular the right-wing program is than how popular the Democratic Party program is, because the Democratic Party doesn't necessarily have any sort of economic transformative plan. They're the party in power during this massive inflation crisis, so they don't really have a lot to stand on in that sense.
And I guess Fetterman also, in a strange way, owing a little bit of his rise to Donald Trump in a weird way, I guess. But I guess also coming to that question where within the Republicans leading up to 2024, if there will be anyone who will have the guts, if you will, to take on Donald Trump in that race, is any conversation emerging on that front before we talk a bit about the ballot measures that were also up for vote?
Yeah, I mean, Trump is still, immensely popular for a Republican candidate. He has a strong, very loyal base. I think the issue that people are worried about, though, is, Trump, obviously, when he lost in 2020, denied the election results, still denies them. Actually, the vast majority of Republicans also don't believe the 2020 election truly went to Joe Biden. And now, in 2022, in the midterms, a lot of these Republicans who agree with Trump that Biden did indeed lose and Trump actually won, a lot of these Republicans were elected to office, many of them in positions that oversee elections in the entire state. Diego Morales in Indiana is one example, election denier who notably actually voted illegally. People found out. But so, in 2024, if a lot of these election deniers are in high positions of power, there could be a full-blown constitutional crisis if they refuse to certify the results. So that's something that a lot of people are worried about.
Right. Also, the kind of deep sort of fissure that there is in the overall polity. We were talking earlier about some of the ballot measures, important ballot measures that were also up for voting. Can you give us a quick sort of roundup of those, particularly those that are would be important to an international audience?
Yeah, so, very notably, abortion rights, although, federal abortion rights were stripped on June 24th by the Supreme Court, abortion rights are extremely popular. And every single there were 5 ballot measures, I believe, that dealt with abortion rights. Every single one passed in favor of abortion rights. So, you see in 5 other states a victory like Kansas, where when abortion is put to a popular vote rather than decided by, 6, unelected judges, it passes. People want abortion rights. Also, conservative states legalizing marijuana, like Montana, notably. You have a lot of different ballot measures that you can see that aren't necessarily conservative, but are passing in conservative states. So a lot of conclusions that people are drawing is that while the Democratic Party may not necessarily be extremely popular, the left-wing policy is popular among the people, whether or not they vote Republican or Democrat. And then also in some states, slavery, very shockingly, was on the ballot. So people were voting in states like Alabama, Tennessee, Vermont, Oregon, on whether or not, slavery was legal. And, how can this be, right? Well, it's because in the US, people who are in prison are legally allowed to be enslaved, essentially, forced to work without pay.
Right.
And so a lot of these states voted to abolish that, essentially. Very notably, Alabama did, a state where there are very grueling conditions for incarcerated workers being forced to work without pay. Louisiana did not pass the ballot measure. So, Louisiana is also very notable for very poor conditions for incarcerated workers. So, very significant stuff.
All right. Thanks very much for rounding it up as best as you could in the time that we have. And of course, we'll be talking much more on Daily Debrief about how post the midterms things might be impacted on the Ukraine war front, as well as leading up to the G20 summit. So thanks again, Natalia, for today. Action on Armed Violence, a UK-based charity, has found that the British military paid compensation to the families of 64 children who were killed as a direct result of its operations in Afghanistan from 2006 to 14. This figure is many times higher than the British government's earlier acceptance of responsibility for the killing of 16 children in the same period, and reflects the trouble with the data, including massive underreporting, procedures for making such claims for compensation, and the wider opacity behind which these invading armies operate. Abdul, good to have you in studio today. First of the 2 stories that we are talking to you about on the show today, the thing that jumped out at me was the price that the UK government seems to have put on the life of Afghan children during their military engagement. Less than $2,000 per child is what the average compensation sort of amounts to in a military operation, and a military budget that, of course, it goes into billions and billions of dollars. Exactly. What are the sort of other or the key elements of this new report, and how are we looking at it?
Basically, it questions the official claims made by the UK military, which has been a part of the NATO-led invasion in Afghanistan and had been there for almost 2 decades. So it specifically mentions a period between 2006 and 2014. Right. The UK military claimed that it only was responsible for the killing of 16 Afghan children. But when the agency which prepared the report, find out, of course, analyzing the data available through the right information and other sources, analyzing the amount of compensation given to people and the claims made in different ways, on the basis that it basically concludes that the numbers are almost minimum 4 times higher than what the UK government has initially claimed. Right. And it says that if we examine it even further, it can go up to 135. Right. That is so the gap between 135 and 16 is a huge gap. That is what the report is primarily pointing at. It also talks about, as you rightly pointed out, that amount which was given to the children, people who were killed, and which is less than to $1,800 plus per person killed. Which is, of course, a very small amount, and it shows that what is the worth for Afghan life in the eyes of the countries, in the eyes of the military who basically carried out the invasion. Apart from that, it also talks about the age, combination of those things, and it says, primarily it says that most of the people, most of the children who were killed in the air raids. More than 50%, 55% children killed were killed in the air raids. So the overall questions around the method of air raids carried into the civilian areas, densely populated areas, indiscriminate bombing, all those were responsible for the killings.
Right, especially when you look at the amount of conversation around these so-called surgical weapons, where precision strikes and all of these things. The other part, Abdul, like you touched on a little bit, the number of claims for compensation and the number of people who actually received some compensation, there's a huge discrepancy there as well, and the burden of course, proving that you have lost a child or a member of your family is also on the family that is claiming, and including at least one report saying that it required interviews from British military personnel to verify that this actually took place. Hard one to prove.
It is almost impossible. If you see, first see the numbers claimed. Most of the countries which send their military into Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere else, always there is a tendency of underreporting the cases for various reasons. One primary reason is the allegations of war crimes which can happen, which can basically question the legitimacy of the armed intervention in external arenas. So apart from that, there are other compensation is one, the matter of accountability is another. So there is always a tendency of underreporting. And that underreporting is done on the basis of the so-called rigorous verification methods. In this particular case, more than 800 applications, quote-unquote applications were invited, and each one had to basically prove that their own relatives, their own children were killed.
Right.
How? You have to produce, in a country like Afghanistan, you have to produce birth certificates, you have to produce other evidences of relationship, you have to basically prove that this is your own child. So this is, in most of the cases, what happens that when a person is killed in an airstrike, it is very difficult to identify for various reasons, because of the violence, the amount of violence which the person has gone through. So it is because of all those procedural basically strictness becomes an excuse to basically deny most of the claims. The entire process sounds inhuman, and that's why we see there is a gross underreporting. That's the primary thing which we should remember. According to UNICEF and other sources, Save the Children, they have come, though it is difficult to establish the exact numbers of people killed, they claim that anywhere between 29,000 to 33,000 children below the age of 18 were killed in last 2 decades in Afghanistan. Of course, mostly, majorly by the airstrikes and the armed operations carried out by the international forces, the NATO forces. And you can see the UK government claims only 16, and the US government has almost similar numbers here and there. So it basically says that these armies, these armed forces, basically do not want to own up their responsibility in killing the innocent lives in the name of fighting against terrorism.
Yeah, and this of course doesn't even take into consideration the indirect impact that leads to so many other sort of
like malnutrition, like a lack of other, lack of medical facilities and all.
Right. All right. Thanks very much, Abdul. I will ask you to stick around because we're talking to you about the next story as well. And finally, air attacks have been reported along the Syria-Iraq border, targeting oil tankers traveling from Iran to Lebanon. Reports indicate that a 22-tanker convoy was targeted right at the border, leading to the destruction of several vehicles and an unconfirmed number of casualties. The United States has denied involvement in the attack, at least directly. Abdul is still with us in studio and has more details. So I guess, Abdul, first up, what is your understanding of this particular strike and who might be behind it?
The reports, there are of course conflicting reports. There is initially it was claimed that the U.S. Armed Forces Air Force, which basically has a base in Deir al-Zur in Syria's eastern part, Al-Talf military base is there. So it was US which carried out attacks, airstrikes on the oil tankers. Around 22 tankers were carrying oil from Iran all through Iraq, Syria, and ultimately destined to Lebanon. And when they crossed Iraq border into Syria, they were basically targeted. So two of the tankers were completely destroyed. Of course, these are oil tankers which basically caused a lot of destructions. And there are different claims, again not verified. Some reports says there are around 15 people killed, but there are other reports which says the number is not yet established. So initially, as I said before, it was suspected that US has been involved because in the past there has been an example of US carrying out such raids on targets here and there, civilian targets. But latest reports are coming from basically Lebanese media, which says that Israel has been responsible. The Israeli drones basically targeted the oil tankers and is responsible for the killing. And we have already talked about it many times on this show, that how Israel has been carrying out such attacks in the past. So there is a precedent and there is a claim. Again, these sources also quote Israeli sources which say that they targeted primarily what they considered the weapon which were supplied through these trucks.
Right. So any sort of, one part I guess again that jumps out is, like you said, there's a precedent for these kind of attacks. The US military has also carried them out. And then the messaging was clear that this is a message that is going to Tehran.
Yeah.
Once again, it's a similar story?
Yeah, of course. If you see, this is a fact that US has a base in the region, and US also has a strong ally in the region, which has been a part of the Syrian war, which is going on for more than a decade now. And US and its allies, sometimes the radical ultra basically fundamentalist groups, both in the Syria's north and in the east, basically have been responsible for such attacks. Since Iran is heavily involved in Syria, providing assistance to Bashar al-Assad government to fight against the anti-state elements in different parts of the country. And we should also remember that Iran is also considered to be what Israel thinks is a threat to the Israeli security. So this geopolitical scenario makes it very clear for all of us to understand that why such attacks are carried out. Sometimes, for example, Israel had carried out hundreds of such attacks, but it has rarely admitted that those attacks were carried out by it. And the reason behind it, because these attacks are illegal. Under no international law, such attacks are justified.
Right.
So it is a violation of Syrian sovereignty, it's a violation of international law, it is a violation of UN Charter, and all of them are members of the United Nations. So they don't want to acknowledge it, but they also want to send a message, as you rightly pointed out, to Iran, given the larger geopolitical scenario, that your presence in Syria is not welcome. And we will try to do whatever possible. Yeah.
And in the bargain, sort of again connected to the last story we talked about, where accountability and collateral damage and these kind of things, Lebanese people, their suffering is further sort of worsened.
Yeah, Lebanon is suffering from economic crisis for last at least 5-6 years. And the recent rise in the global prices of oil has made that crisis even deeper. And one major reason for the crisis is the fuel prices. Lebanon is one of those countries, rare countries in the region, which heavily depends on the import of oil. And because of the higher prices and because of the economic crisis in the country, they are unable to import. In that condition, Iranians are basically providing cheaper oil, helping the common Lebanese to kind of deal with the day-to-day scarcity of fuel, electricity, heavily dependent on the oil and all. So in that sense, if you attack such oil tankers which are essential for it, basically it questions, it basically an attack, a war against the common Lebanese people as well.
All right, thanks for that update, Abdul. And with that, we also bring to a close this episode of Daily Debrief. As always, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for more details on these stories and all of the rest of the work that we do. And of course, don't forget to follow us on the social media platform of your choice. We'll be back with another episode tomorrow, same time, same place. Until then, thank you for watching. Stay safe. Goodbye.